what we know now from research in a lot of parts of the world, physicians literally all over the world have described a common pattern of experience that seems to unfold with many, many people who are on the verge of death. They describe to us how when they are critically ill, they can feel their heart stop beating. They may hear the physician or nurse or someone standing by say that oh my gosh, you know, he's dead, or we've lost her, or something like that. But they say that from their perspective, they suddenly feel themselves leaving their physical bodies entirely. They seem to watch the events of the resuscitation from a point of view up above. Typically, it's right below the ceiling. They will tell us that after a while in this, they find out that no one can see them, no one can hear them, although they can see and understand perfectly what's going on, and see the events of the resuscitation down below. But they become aware of what they call a tunnel or a passageway, and they seem to go through this tunnel into a very brilliant and warm and loving light. They say that they are surrounded, permeated by this light. They describe feelings of complete love, absolute, indescribable peace. They say in this situation they may see relatives or friends of theirs who have already died, seem to be there to meet them, to try to help them through this transition. Very often these patients describe what we call panoramic memory, where they say that all of the events of their lives are displayed around them in a kind of full-color, three-dimensional panorama, which they witness from a third-person point of view. And after a while in this experience, they all have to go back. Some of them are told, you have to return, it's not your time to die yet. Other people say that they're given a choice. Incidentally, when they are given that choice, they invariably say that they, for themselves, they would rather have stayed in this realm of complete love. But they choose to go back. Typically, it's for their children. They say they have children left to raise. When they come back, I think that from the point of view of psychiatry, this is the most interesting aspect of this, because these people are totally transformed by this experience. What they all tell me that they learned through this review of their lives is that the most important thing we can do while we're alive is to learn how to love. And whatever their life perspective might have been before this, whether they were after power or money or fame or all those other things, they come back from this saying that the most essential thing we can do while we're here is to learn to love and to have good relationships with others. Quite a number of them also describe how they feel that in this review of their lives, there are sections there in the review where they have been learning something or seeking wisdom or truth, and they feel that this is important too while we're alive. I think the most striking finding with these people, though, who return from these experiences is that they have absolutely no more fear of death.
Tell me more about that moment when people have described the opportunity they have to look back at their entire life.
Certainly one of the more dramatic aspects of the near-death experience is this life review. And what they'll tell us is that they are surrounded by a panorama of all the things they have done. I've asked many of them, and they say literally, yes, every single thing that they have ever done. And they say that you witness this from a third-person perspective, that you see yourself as one person among many, but that if you see yourself doing a loving action, then when that action results, you are the people that you have benefited. In other words, you are in the consciousness of the person that you have brought good feelings to. But on the other hand, if you hurt someone, if you're mean to someone, unloving to someone, then when that action results, you feel the feelings that you have brought about in the life of that person. And it's quite life-changing for these people. I have a friend, Dr. Göran Grip, who's a professor of anesthesiology at the Uppsala Medical University in Sweden, who has interviewed many, many Swedes who have had near-death experiences. And he got interested in this because he had his own near-death experience when he was a kid. And he, in a very articulate way, described this. He said that for each event that you see in this life review, that you have a choice just by directing your attention, as it were. You can look at it in either one of two ways. You can look at it this way, as it were, and you can see trailing off from behind that action all of the events in your life that led up to it. Or on the other hand, you can switch your focus in this way, and you can see trailing off of it in this direction all of the subsequent events, not only for yourself but for others. So you see how you have affected others.
Tell me more about this realm of learning or knowledge.
Well, I'm impressed with how many people I find who have, or when they have these near-death experiences, that one of their first impulses afterward is to go learn something or start a new career. A 66-year-old woman who had a heart attack, who had last been to school at age 17 when she had graduated from high school. Immediately after her near-death experience, and after she was out of the hospital, went to the local junior college and signed up for courses. Or the man I met in Canada a year or so ago, who was 81 years old, who had just recently completed his PhD degree because he had a near-death experience in his 70s and was so moved by what he saw that he decided he wanted to go on to school. I think that knowledge seems to be a part of this too, that as many of these patients who have returned from the verge of death tell me that they feel that what this process of learning or knowledge is something that goes on for eternity, that even when we die, that we will be going to school.
Is there a sense that we get to take anything with us?
Seems that the only thing people are able to take are their love and their knowledge, their wisdom, that, obviously all these other things that we value go away. If if you're into your bodily beauty or your bodily vigor, that goes. If you are into money or fame or prestige, power, none of those things are relevant in this next stage. It seems to be the love and the wisdom.
What kind of changes in attitude do people have after they've come out of this?
Well, one thing about these near-death experiences and their effects is that they don't make people into Pollyannas by any means. And one psychiatrist who had this experience told me, to quote his exact words, "It makes your humanity even more of a burden in a way." And by that what he meant was that even when you have seen this vision of love and you know the importance of love, and that it's still hard in the everyday world to deal with people, and you feel the ups and downs, depressions, anger, all those things. One thing we see quite often with these people who have these near-death experiences is that a divorce follows. Because if you can imagine it this way, it's like one of the more common patterns I see is that at a certain point, say in his 50s, there's a businessman, for instance, who has spent his whole life in his work every day, and he just so focused on the work. And his wife is constantly saying, "Oh, I wish he would be more emotional. I wish he would not be so busy all the time. I wish he would have more time to be." And then the husband has the heart attack and has the near-death experience, and then goes through that very transformation. And then after this, they say, "Oh, I really do now want to be, learn about these things and so on, and be sensitive." It's very upsetting to the wife because, the system seeks homeostasis, as we say, that even though people might have imagined that they would have wanted their father or their husband to be a very different person, when the actual transformation takes place, sometimes they really, really just are not comfortable with it. And so it does, and sometimes, because when people have this vision, there is no doubt They are absolutely sure. You know, from then on out, their lives are changed. And if the spouse is unable to adapt to this, then very often we do see these divorces.
At the Earth Network, we define environment as being more than just our external environment. It's the internal environment as well. How do you see what people go through with the near-death experience as affecting both their internal and their external environments?
In one way, it makes the external environment a lot less important, I would say, in the sense that it seems to me, and I'm talking here only abstractly because I remain myself deeply afflicted by numerous neurotic conflicts, so I haven't gotten the inside straight yet. But just looking at those who have, those folks who have had a near-death experience, for instance, and I see the dramatic changes in their lives and the way their eyes look and the sense of peace they have, they don't get troubled so much about those external things. The normal external things we think of, you know, how much money you have, or all those things. But at the same time, they do become concerned about the larger external environment in a much more deep way than before. And one of the most common phrases or turns of phrase I hear from these people who almost die is that when they're talking about how they're transformed, they say they come back from their experience with a sense of urgency.
Now, this isn't just an isolated case for you to draw these conclusions from these people. How many have you talked to?
Well, since 1965, I've talked with about 2,500 people who have returned from the verge of death, and many of my colleagues around the world have had the same kind of experience. Dr. Bruce Grayson of the University of Connecticut Department of Psychiatry has been investigating the near-death experiences of suicide attempters since about 1976. Dr. Kenneth Ring of the University of Connecticut. We have colleagues literally now all over the world who have looked into this, including pediatricians who have actually found these experiences now among kids. Even very, very young children have this same form of experience. And George Gallup, who got very interested in this a few years ago, used the resources of his polling organization to try to find out how many Americans might have been through something like this, and he was surprised to learn that over 8 million American adults have been through this.
What about those people who have a near-death experience but don't remember it, or the people who have a life-changing experience without necessarily having a near-death experience?
Well, certainly I've known quite a lot of people who have had spiritual experiences when they weren't near death. And I've talked with a lot of people who almost died, who were pronounced dead and resuscitated, who don't recall anything. And there's only one of those who didn't recall anything about their trip that did have these life changes, and this person felt that there had probably been something in the nature of a near-death experience that had gone on at that time which he did not remember. But one piece of evidence that we have which suggests that perhaps it is the near-death experience itself which causes these transformations in consciousness rather than just the mere fact that the person almost died is the work of Dr. Bruce Grayson at the University of Connecticut, who interviewed the people who had come close to death as a result of suicide attempts. And what he found was that when he divided these groups who had almost died when they had attempted to kill themselves into those who did have a near-death experience and those who did not, what he found was that if you continue to follow these two groups over the period of time, those who did not have a near-death experience continue as a group to have a high rate of subsequent attempts at suicide, while the patients who do have a near-death experience when they're at the point of death subsequently have an essentially zero rate of any further attempts at suicide. And what they tell us when they come back from this is that they learned in this experience the value of life, that we're here for a purpose, and that you can't really call it quits and just, leave before your time. In psychiatry, we always talk about the geographical cure. People who things get hot for them at one place due to their conflicts and all, and so they say, I'm going to move, and you move somewhere else, and there, of course, in your new home, and you open the door, and guess who's there? It's the old problem. So it seems to be that way with suicide. But that kind of study that he does strongly suggests that it's the experience, that it is the near-death experience which brings about these transformations in the personality.
Why do you think there's been a suppression in the United States and in our culture over the past few hundred years of some of these ideas?
I'm not sure. As I reflect on why, as a culture, we have strayed so far from these altered states of consciousness, and where we value the ego-aware, reflective, wide-awake state of consciousness to such a marked degree in our society. Well, we live, of course, in a world surrounded by machinery and gadgets, and which are primarily, we work from an ego-aware, reflective state of consciousness. Who knows exactly why our society has become so narrow in its focus? We essentially use one channel of consciousness, whereas in other cultures, there are other channels which were used. The ancient Greeks, for instance, spent a lot of their time in what we would today call the hypnagogic state of awareness, where they could see visions which most of us, would not be open to most of us.
How do you define the hypnagogic state?
Hypnagogy is the state of awareness between sleeping and waking, where you have these very unusual images and beautiful visions and so on. And many interesting creative figures in the history of our world have used this hypnagogic state as a way to get creative ideas. Thomas Edison, for instance, would go back into his studio when he was working with a problem that he couldn't solve, and he would lean back in his chair and drift into the hypnagogic state, and would get his flashes of insight, which resulted in all of these amazing inventions. And then, in order to keep himself from going all the way into sleep and thereby forgetting some of these things, he made it his practice to hold a metal ball bearing, one in each hand, and he would put his arms in his lap, and he would drift into this trance. And then, if he started going on into sleep, his muscle tone would relax and his arms would slip off his lap, and he had a metal dishpan, one on each side. It would clang, it would wake him up. Many great creative thinkers and writers, painters, Dali, Picasso, scientists like Kekulé, the inventor of the benzene ring, Singer, the inventor of the sewing machine, and many creative writers, Robert Louis Stevenson with Treasure Island and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, Charles Dickens, George Sand. Many of these people used hypnagogic awareness in their creative work.
It's interesting that we haven't heard much about that. I understand you're writing the first scientific account of this state or study since 1928. Why hasn't there been more interest?
I don't know. Science is antithetical in one way to altered states of consciousness like this, because the frame of mind or consciousness that we're mostly in when we do scientific work is the ego-aware, reflective, analytic mode of consciousness. But I think the real case can be made for trying more systematically to exploit these altered states of consciousness by teaching people how to have them. The reason being that it's such a wonderful wellspring of creative ideas and problem solving. In fact, if you go back into the history of science, one of the pioneering figures in the formulation of what we today call scientific method was René Descartes, the French philosopher and scientist. And Descartes, if you go back to his writings in which he describes how it was he came up with this concept, it was actually in the form of a spiritual experience that he had. He was in a state where he was just really, really agitated that nobody could agree on what the truth was. That in his culture in that day and age, it was, you know, anybody's guess. And so he, in essence, he prayed for God to send him some sort of vision or way of knowing what the truth was and to establish the truth. And then he began to have a series of visionary experiences, and out of that came the rules for the direction of the mind and a discourse on method, which actually has been one of the foundations of science. I think probably there are several reasons why our modern culture suppresses altered states of consciousness. One is that you know, we live in a world primarily of technologically developed gadgetry and so on, and you would hardly want your Amtrak engineer to be, as he was speeding the train down the track, to be going, you know. You have to be, you know, in a pretty good state of awareness to operate heavy equipment, which most of us are doing all the time. You know, most Americans go everywhere they go with 3,000 or 4,000 pounds of metal, which is so amazing to me. I mean, the way we are with these automobiles. And I walk about 10 miles a day, and a couple of years ago, I was walking where I used to live. I walked out in the country, and I had a long route. And I was walking past this woman's house, and as I walked past, I saw her house on the right, and it was maybe 50 feet off the road. And I saw her come out of her kitchen door and get into her car and drive the 50 feet to the end of her driveway and stop at the mailbox and get the mail. And at this point, I was horrified. I said, "Oh, no, it can't be." And so I was so relieved when she turned right out of her driveway, and then she rode down another about 30 feet, and then turned left into her friend's driveway and went maybe the 25 or 30 feet down the friend's driveway to the carport, then got out of the car and went inside her friend's house. That's astounding to me, you know, but that's how we are. We're totally dependent on machines now. Yeah, that's one thing. Also, I think, you know, people are basically afraid that unconscious contents will erupt during hypnagogic states. We all have stuff in our unconscious that is unpleasant to us or that we're fearful of, and we are afraid that if we open up, then all these terrible things will come out. Well, what I've been so surprised to learn is that all these supposedly terrifying things that are in there, the reason why that feels so bad is that they are in there. It's not that what they are, it's just it's the very mental act of forcing them in. If somebody took a rose and without you seeing it, they put your hand around it and then they told you to squeeze your hand on it as tight as you could for a couple of hours, you would probably have the feeling that that thing that was in your hand was a really horrible kind of object. And so you might get actually afraid to open up your hand and see that it's just a rose. And I think it's that way with much of the stuff that's inside us that we keep locked up. It only seems so fierce because, and so terrible, because the mental energy that we put into repressing that into our unconscious mind requires so much energy that it's painful.
Have you noticed a coming together of science and spirituality recently?
It's so interesting that you should ask me that. Because I don't know, first of all, not being a social prophet or anything like that, but certainly I have heard so many of, you know, people bringing up that theme recently. I think we have reached a point in science, if you want to call it that, or in organized human inquiry, where now we are able, very easily to induce experiences which have always been called, when they occur spontaneously, have always been thought of throughout the history of mankind as paranormal or supernatural experiences. But now we can very easily induce various experiences like this. And at this point it becomes possible then, I think, to study what have always been called paranormal experiences by use of the scientific method.
Do you see a similarity between an individual near-death experience and a planetary near-death experience?
I don't know. It's amazing how much it takes to get us to see the point, I suppose. I mean, we had this terrible war, and what did that change? I mean, things seem to be just as crazy over there as they were before, if not more so. So what is going to happen? I'm so curious. And as it's over the last few years, I've seen more and more people seem to be waking up to this, that realizing that, hey, something is going on here that's going to require some attention, or else we'll all be dead. Or certainly that our children will all be dead and not have a very pleasant place to live. It's interestingly enough not scary to me, because even years ago, back in the mid-1970s, was where I first saw myself that this is where it was all headed. And so the horror and the emotionality I felt back in the 1970s, if you know what I mean, the fear. And to me, it's not fearful anymore. I'm just sort of watching it unfold and very curious about what's going to happen.
If you had one message to share with the world right now, what would it be?
Oh, I think the most important thing that all these people from these extraordinary states of consciousness bring back is the love. That, you know, that it's very, very important that that's the only way to happiness, is love. That all the other things are just illusions.
At the end of last week's show, we ran a public service announcement about gang violence that is surrounded by controversy. You responded to our request for comments. Here are some of them.
I think you should show that commercial quite often. It's too true.
I'm a black male, 32. I 100% agree with it, and I think it's about time that more of that type of thing is shown, not just to the black community, but to everyone, so that the consciousness can be raised as to what's really happening among black people.
I would like to say that it's a good commercial and that it ought to be run more often. Thank you.
I've never seen anything so powerful. If that commercial doesn't slap you into reality, nothing would.
About the killings, I think that's an issue that needs to be addressed among us black people, among all people.
My comment was on the gang, anti-gang ad, and I thought that was excellent.
Sweeping it under the rug or pretending that it does not exist is not the way to face it, and labeling it racist just because it tends to upset some people also does not make that right. So I think showing that commercial is very appropriate. I think it serves a good cause, which is primarily to show the public the facts.
What are we to do with those people who burn vast amounts of natural resources like it doesn't matter? How do we instill in them the need to care for the land we live on, the air we breathe? By golly, I think you did it, Doc. Now you only have about 300 million more to go. How about it, folks? Think the Doc could use a little hand here.